I've got a koan, and this is Tozan's Cold and Heat, which is from the Blue Cliff record. It's case number 43. And with all Blue Cliff record koan, you get three parts. You've got the main case, then you've got an introduction by Engo, who put the collection together, and then you've got some comments that were attached later by Secho. So you've got three parts to this. Engo's introduction. 10,000 ages abide by the phrase that determines heaven and earth. Even the 1,000 sages cannot understand the ability to catch tigers and rhinos. Without any further traces or obstruction, the whole being appears everywhere equally. If you want to understand the hammer and tongues of transcendence, you need the forge and bellows of an adept. But say, since ancient times, has there ever been a family style or not? To test, I am citing this old case, look. And this is the main case. A monk asked Tozan Ryokai, when cold and heat come, how does one avoid them? Tozan said, why not go where there is no cold or heat? The monk said, what is the place where there is no cold or heat? And Tozan said, when it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. And then Secho's verse reads, he reaches out, but it's still inaccessible. Why must absolute and relative be in an arrangement? The ancient crystal palace reflects the bright moon. The sneaky dog goes up the stairs for naught, or nout, as we say in Yorkshire. So I'm quite pleased actually to have this with me. I planned this before I came, but you know, we were talking on when was it? Monday morning, about koan and about how to get life into koan and how to make them meaningful for us. And what I like about this koan is it gets right to the heart of the human condition. It's about cold and heat, but actually that's a metaphor, and you can understand that in a lot of different ways. But the brilliant thing about cold and heat is that everyone at some point, and usually lots of times, experiences cold and heat. You know, if we picked another binary pair or another set of examples, maybe we might have thought, well, I don't know if I've ever really experienced that. But we've all experienced cold and heat, so straight away we can relate to it. And when I first started looking at this, I was asking myself, well, what are really good examples of when I've experienced cold and heat? And best example of cold that came to my mind was I climbed Mont Blanc once, and I was standing on the summit, and it was minus 17. And it was so cold I was getting frostnip on the end of my nose, and every time I breathed in, the hairs in my nostrils were freezing. So it was pretty cold. And then I was thinking, okay, that's that, but what about heat? And I think my best case of heat was I went to the Grand Canyon, and it gets very, very hot as you go down the Grand Canyon. And I went in August, which is probably not the recommended time. And they tell you to carry 4 litres of water when you get down the Grand Canyon. I did. I just didn't drink them. So I got down to the bottom, and I couldn't understand why I was feeling so giddy. And you know, my head was spinning, I was feeling slightly nauseous. And then it finally dawned on me, maybe I'm just starting to get heat exhaustion here. You know. But you know, this is a metaphor, and it could stand for all sorts of things. Yesterday, Sensei was talking about the 5 skandha, and you know, it could stand for the 5 skandha and the 4 conditions. This reference to cold and heat. You know, the 5 skandha describe what it means to be alive. You know, usually we think about it in terms of what it means to be a human being, but it's what it means to be alive as well. I think so. So you've got the body, you've got feeling, you've got perception, and then you've got I've forgotten that. Then you've got volitional activity, recognition, And then you've got consciousness. Have I missed one? Is that 5? That's 5, yeah. So you've got the 5 skandhas, and then the 4 conditions, and heat and cold might actually be a summarization of the four elements, 4 conditions, which are earth, fire, water, and air. Thank you. Yeah. So maybe when you put heat and fire together, you disturb those ones. But there are others. You know, you could have the 3 poisons: greed, anger, ignorance. Or then the 6 so-called thieves. That's an obscure one. So you know, we've got these perceptions. We've got feeling, thought. Because thought is a perception. We don't think of it that way, but in Mahayana Buddhism, thought is a perception. You've got feeling, thought, vision, taste, touch, smell. And you have a consciousness of each one. You have an awareness of each one. And that awareness reaches out to things. And it makes distinctions, it makes judgments. I like blue, I don't like red. I like the smell of custard, I don't like the smell of gravy. You know, we start making all these kinds of distinctions. And that's what these perception consciousnesses do. And they're referred to as thieves because they take us out, they trap us. I mean, what traps who? That's a question you could ask, but that's the point. So, underneath all this, what are we really talking about? We're talking about conditions. And, you know, it gets given lots of different names: phenomena, 10,000 phenomena, 10,000 dharmas, samsara. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about conditions, and we're talking about life in the world of conditions. And the life of any being is characterized by the first truth in Buddhism, as you all know. You know, dukkha. It's marked by that. So we're talking about being in that state of life, which is called, I mean, it gets translated as suffering. It's not very good, but one of the ways in which this realm is talked about as Shakyamuni Buddha's realm, and it's called the Saha realm, which means the realm of endurance, which is quite nice, I think. I quite like that. So the world is full of these conditions: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sometimes, but they're here. They're all around us. Our lives are completely and utterly embedded in these conditions. We embody them. We have bodies. So we are inextricably connected with these conditions. And heat and cold is like a metaphor for that. And, you know, the question, how does one avoid them? How does one avoid heat and cold? It sounds maybe, you know, a bit of a seasoned practitioner, maybe you think that's a bit of a silly question. But actually it's fair enough. It's fair enough. I mean, it's the basic question that underlies most thinking around religious questions, most thinking around philosophical questions, scientific questions even. Psychological questions, because it's all about wanting to get back to understand something, to either be saved from something or to control it, when you think about it. So it's a reasonable question, and it's a very valid question for anybody who's self-aware of their situation to want to ask it. So it gets right to the heart of the human condition. And what we were talking about on Monday, and I think this koan illustrates it, is that if you want to make koan meaningful, then you've got to see how they relate to life, and you make them meaningful because your life is meaningful. Meaningful in the sense of, I am engaging with it, I'm connecting with it. I want to understand this. So the question's fair enough. You know, how do you avoid cold and heat? I mean, that's the kind of question, we may not phrase it like that, but it's the kind of question that does bring us to practice. And then Engo starts in his introduction by looking at all this and posing the question of the transcendence of cold and heat. You know, how do you get beyond all these conditions? So his first line is 10,000 ages abide by the phrase that determines heaven and earth. In other words, there is a phrase he's suggesting to us that captures everything, captures all these conditions, brings them all together, synthesizes everything into one pure, pristine state, one pure, pristine understanding. Something we can get to. Mind of God, if you like. Stephen Hawking, who died not long ago, was looking for the fundamental formula which would explain everything. And I think he said this, didn't he? If we could get this, we would understand the mind of God. Well, he died. But the question is there, nevertheless. You know, is there some phrase? And it may not be a phrase. You know, don't get caught on the words. He's using the word phrase, but you know, it may not be a phrase. After all, Zen's beyond words and phrases, isn't it? So, you know, what? There is something he's suggesting. If there's a transcendence, then there must be something. And it's something that only we can grasp. It's no good hearing it and not understanding it. It's something we've got to really grasp and embody and understand in ourselves. Which is what I was saying to begin with. You know, you've got to get to the heart of life and make it meaningful for yourself if you're going to make anything of a koan. I mean, actually, if you're going to make anything of your practice at all, this is so. So we have to really put ourselves into our practice, into our koan, into our lives, if we want to get to some sense of connection and meaning within it. Which means it's alone. It's something we do alone. You know, it sounds a strange thing to say because we've all come together and we are working collectively, and our mutual support for one another is mutually beneficial, for sure. But what each of us has to do, we have to do for ourselves. It's our ownmost journey. So, whatever this phrase is, whatever this understanding is, it's something that it's this one's responsibility. And there was a conversation between Bazo and Layman Pang, Ho Koji, as the Japanese call him. And they were exploring this, and Ho Koji said, what kind of person is the one who does not keep company with anything or anyone? In other words, what kind of person is the master of this phrase? You could put it that way, take Engo's expression. And Bazo said, I will tell you, when you've swallowed in one gulp all the waters in the West River. So we could make a koan out of that. We could make a really nice koan. You know, how do you swallow all the waters in the Mersey in one gulp? And it sounds absurd, doesn't it? And you know, those of us who have been practicing a while will think, well, you know, it's just another one of those koan. What's the point of it? But it has no point unless we engage with what it's getting at. And what it's getting at is what we are about. And you know, Bazo is talking about one gulp, and Engo is talking about a phrase. So we're not necessarily talking about a word or a formula or the secret message, the last word of Zen. It may not be that. It's something much more meaningful for us in our own lives that we're looking for. But that's the thing that this is all pointing to. That's the thing we have to connect with when we want to study koan. Otherwise, it does just become a meaningless game. And then when we can really engage with it, then we start to see Engo's second line, which is that even thousands of sages cannot understand the ability to catch tigers and rhinos. And I kind of worry a bit about that analogy because I fear it might be losing its meaning. You know, it's another metaphor. We've had heat and cold, well now we've been given tigers and rhinos. And you know, we can sort of say, well, what are tigers and rhinos? And it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to kind of work it out. You know, the stuff that worries us, gives us anxiety, or fears, or preoccupations we've got. It's like they've got the horns of a rhino, or the claws of a tiger. So you can sort of see meaning in it. But I worry about it slightly because, I mean, you probably all saw, whoops, I worry about this as well. Yeah, I was going to say I worry about it slightly because I feel we're losing something. You know, in our spread of suburbia and our spread of industrial farming, we're losing a contact with wildness, and I think that matters. You know, there was the last male northern rhino died a couple of weeks ago. You probably all know that. And I was checking up before I came. There are 650 black rhinos left in the world. And when you look at tigers, there are about 4,000. So they're doing a bit better. But a lot of the subspecies of tiger have gone. And, you know, it's hard to think, but this country was once home to rhinoceros, woolly rhinos and mammoths, aurochs, tigers, probably the saber-tooth variety, but tigers were here, bears, wolves. They've all gone. And it's not, and I'm not just being sentimental about that. I'm not just saying, oh, it's a shame, why don't we reintroduce the wolf? Although that would be nice. I think there's a serious point here. Because when you confront wildness, what do you confront? Death. Yeah. Yeah, you do. You confront the first noble truth. You confront life as suffering. You confront dukkha. Because nature isn't nice, actually. You know, we get very sentimental about nature and romantic about it, but actually it's brutal. You know, evolution is a grim thing when you look at it from an individual perspective. And we lost that. We've lost that. We lose in our civilization and our cultural urbanization. We kind of lose this stuff. And there's a perspective that comes from it, which I think is very valuable. And I brought something I wanted to read to you, which I found in a book by Charles Fisher called Meditation in the Wild. So I'll just read this to you. In the summer of 2010, I headed 2,500 miles northward towards Telegraph Creek in the coastal mountains of northwestern British Columbia. I'd been on the road 8 days when I arrived at my friend Wade Davis's summer place, an old fishing lodge on Lake Eyalaway in the Skeena Mountains. I got there a few days in advance of Wade and his family. I wanted to spend that time sitting quietly. During the day, I sat meditating on Wade's dock, looking out at the lake. It was peaceful, sitting on the dock, silently watching the sun cross the sky, listening to the sounds of nature, and simply being with exotic creatures. So he got very carried away by white-winged crossbills, for example, at this point. And then he carries on. After a few days of so spent, I thought I would take a walk over to the nearby abandoned campground. I headed out to the road, down the dirt driveway, and then onto a rutted entrance to the old campground. My mind was at rest, so I was very alert. The brush along the entranceway was quite thick. A couple of 100 feet in, I stopped short, noticing a large bear on the edge of the roadway. It saw me at exactly the same time I saw it, but it grunted in surprise. It was a beautiful gold colour, with a dark head and extended muzzle. I thought at once, grizzly, but I wasn't sure. It clearly didn't care for my presence and backed away into the dense brush, peeking out at me. My curiosity got the better of my discretion. I looked at it through my binoculars, wanting to see if it had a hump, which would have confirmed it was a grizzly. So I scraped my foot on the ground. Its curiosity overcame its fear. It returned to the edge of the road, and then I like this bit. Then it defied my understanding of the correct bear behaviour and kept advancing towards me. Instantly, my calm vanished, and I could feel my heart beating. I slowly walked backwards towards the road and retreated back to Wade's place. A beeline between the camping ground and the lodge was a mere 100 feet of tall grass. And when I returned to sitting on the dock, I faced inland, in the direction the bear would have come. Key bit. My sitting had changed. And then he talks a bit more about it, and he says that his alertness increased, and it took a while for his heart to stop beating, and that he was full of this inchoate fear which he then had to watch. But that's really interesting. My sitting had changed. And I was reflecting on that before I gave a talk. And I never sit so alertly as before I'm about to give a talk. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. Why? What? Well, I'm not going to try and answer it. But there is something about our engagement with life which we need to take seriously. Sensei was talking yesterday about going beyond your comfortable limits. I think that's the expression you used, Sensei, I can't remember. But, get out of your comfort zone. Get out of your comfort zone. Because that's where you learn. That's where we really start to find out what we're about. And if a bear came wandering in here when we were all sitting, our sitting would change. Yeah? And that's the kind of thing we need to cultivate if we want to really see clearly. But instead what we spend most of our time doing is dozing and dreaming away, and I'm as guilty as anybody else. We've got lots of time, haven't we? It won't be this session, maybe next one. But there's a bear in the room. We've got to think about these things. There are tigers and rhinos jumping around. We need to deal with them. And it says here that the 10,000 ancestors can't see how. The 1,000 sages cannot understand the ability to catch tigers and rhinos. Well, why not? Because in his next line he says, without any further traces or obstruction, the whole being appears everywhere equally. We spend most of our time preoccupied by these traces and obstruction, getting lost in our daydreams, getting lost in all our worries and anxieties about what would make for a comfortable life in the end. But life's not comfortable. And this is inviting us to really look at that. And you can do that when you sit. Because you can really look at whatever's going on. When you really engage with whatever's going on, then you start to drop all those preoccupations, all those memories, all those frustrations, plans, ambitions, irritations, you name it. They're endless. There are hordes of them. They may not be in the world anymore, but there are hordes of them in our heads. And we can start to just drop them. It's now the third day of Sesshin. So maybe you're finding that. Maybe the tigers and rhinos are calming down a bit. And then you can start to really see them. And when you start to really see them, he uses the word catch. But, get comfortable with them. But, there is a big catch in this, which is, as Zengo says, if you want to understand the hammer and tongs of transcendence, you need the forge and bellows of an adept. We've got to get cold. If you want to understand cold, we've got to get cold. If you want to understand heat, we've got to get hot. If we want to engage with the practice, then we need to get down on that cushion. We need to come on Sesshin. We need to put ourselves into it. And we can get trite about these things. Say, oh well, there's nothing to get. There's nothing to get. This is it. But how clear are we about it? That's the question we each have to be honest with ourselves about. How clear am I about this? And can I be ultimately as clear as I need to be? And if not, then what? Then sit down again. Come again. Look again. Keep going. And then he was obviously not very happy with the idea that something can be accomplished in just put away. So he says, to test, I am citing the old case, look. A monk asked Tozan Ryokai, when cold and heat come, how does one avoid them? And Tozan said, why not go where there is no cold or heat? The monk said, in what place is there no cold or heat? When it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. Dogen Zenji was really quite taken with this koan. Tozan is in our lineage. I think Tozan Ryokai is, I can't remember where he comes in it, but he's one of the key figures in Soto Zen. But in any event, Tozan was really impressive as far as Dogen was concerned. And he devoted a fascicle of his Shobogenzo to this koan called Shunju. And he says we should really look at this question, how does one avoid them? And really go into it deeply. How do I avoid anything in my life? You know, in some ways it seems sort of obvious that there are things I can do. If I'm too hot, I can open the window. If I'm too cold, I can put another pullover on. And we could sort of read this as a way of saying, well, okay, you've got these extremes, you can get hot, you can get cold. So what we want to do is get the mixer tap out and kind of get everything to this nice tepid condition. Maybe bring life down to body temperature. And we can sort of have the idea, I suppose, that that's what we're trying to do. Just make everything smooth and easy, calm, peaceful, nothing happens. And in Shunju, Dogen says that if we get into that place, then it's like a kingfisher who builds his nest in a jeweled tower, which actually just means it's stagnant. You just could construct this. We'd talk about an ivory tower, wouldn't we? But you just kind of construct this idealized space, and then he talks about the kingfisher. But this beautiful creature then goes and sits in this idealized space and stays there. Great. Well, the other way he describes it is he says it's like two mandarin ducks chained in a golden hall. I have no idea what he's talking about. The best I can say is maybe that's like saying yin and yang, sort of boxed into something, locked into something, so they can't move. I don't know, but you get the idea. We try and idealize things, and then once we've idealized them, we've got if only everything was like this, my life would be perfect. Perfect partner, perfect house, perfect car, perfect job, perfect children. Great. Do you know anybody like that? And how long does it last? It's really interesting, and that's not it. And this how do you avoid it? Dogen says it's like trying to put a tail where your head should be, and it's not possible. And to go into it very deeply, he says what you discover is that how did he put it? The cold is like the twinkling eye of the ancestors, and the heat is the warm body of Tozan. So he's saying we have to get really intimate with our lives, really engage with them very, very closely. So that then what happens? Well, there's a commentary by Master Wanshu, which Dogen explores in Shunju, which talks about then what happens. And he says what Master Wanshu says is well put, which is always a sign with Dogen that he doesn't agree. And what Master Wanshu says is that this conversation is a bit like a game of Go between Tozan and the monk. I don't play Go, I don't know the rules of it, but I guess you could see it as being a bit like playing chess or checkers or any game, actually. Any game. But he says if what Wanshu says is that Tozan moves, and if the monk doesn't respond, then Tozan will make a different move to try and get the monk to see the point. So Tozan is saying, why don't you go where there is no cold or heat? But the monk doesn't get that. So he says, well, what place is that? So then he says, well, the cold kills you and the heat kills you, so he's taking a different direction. And Dogen said, well, let's look at this. Let's look at this, because if we talk about this in terms of a game of opposition, the minute, if I'm playing a game of Go with one of you, and I see you as my opponent, Dogen's saying, I've already taken a penalty of 9 stones, which means nothing to me until I actually work out what the hell he's talking about. But apparently in Go, you get penalties. If you get blocked by your partner, you get given penalty stones. And the one who's got the most penalty stones at the end has lost the game. I think that's how it works. But you can only have 8. So if I'm playing a game with you, and I think you're obstructing me, you're blocking me, I've already got 9 stones. I've already lost. So he says, what kind of game is this? Unwinnable. Yeah, unwinnable. Unwinnable. But it's a game, right? I mean, if we're playing a game, then I've got to oppose you, haven't I? You've got to oppose me. I've got to try and defeat you. Isn't that how it works? Isn't that how games work? Isn't that how life works a lot of the time? When I think about this, it applies to most things, doesn't it? You know, think about sport. It certainly applies to that. But think about any argument you've ever had, and how entrenched we can get in our own position on something. I'm right. Prove I'm right. You know, we get really kind of knotted about this stuff. Usually it's trivial, not always, but you know, we get really upset and attached to our position on something. Or think about business. The business works like that. Competition, the marketplace, it all works like that. And yet he's saying that this is all. If the minute there's dualism involved, you're already defeated. So how can you have a game? How can you have anything where there's no dualism? And that's what he's inviting us to do. And then he explains it a little more, and he says, if you thoroughly oppose me, where am I? Now that's really interesting. Because bring that right back to where we start with the koan. If you thoroughly go into cold, if you thoroughly go into heat, where are you?
You're just cold.
Yeah, I think Chris was talking about this yesterday, wasn't he? You know, did you say something about dancing? Something like that. You were talking about doing something in such a way that the sense of self starts to dissolve into it. I think that's what you were saying. And there's a famous Eagles song, which I forget which one it is now, but the line is something like, how can you tell the dancer from the dance? And we all know this stuff, you know. We go through life and we get really engrossed in something, and then we think, hey, where did the time go? It can even happen in Zazen sometimes. Honestly, really, you know, you can get so lost in what you're doing that you do disappear. The trouble is, in most of our lives, we've got no way of recognising that that's what's happening. Everybody goes, oh, no self, big deal. You know, they make this big thing out of this idea of mushin, no self. But I mean, actually, it's perfectly normal. It's just we don't normally recognise it for what it is. And we don't see what it's telling us about those occasions when the self sticks up like a sore thumb and is really objecting to this cold or heat, this pain in my leg, this irritation with my boss, with my spouse, with me, whatever it might be, you know. So that, you know, he's saying that there's a clue in all this. This when it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. Dogen says there's a very big hint in this. A very big hint. And we need to see it. The trouble for us, unfortunately, let me find it now. I wrote all these notes and I haven't used them. Yeah. The trouble is that the situation we create for ourselves is more like this one. This is a poem by Saigo. And you get these analogies for what happens when you sit, and particularly for things like if you do Shikantaza, dropped off body and mind is Dogen's big thing with Shikantaza, and it's what we've just been talking about. It's just being completely involved in what we're doing. So there's no commentary. There's no traces, no obstructions, if only the clock would go a bit faster, or I'm looking forward to lunch. There's none of that's kind of preoccupying. So I bet it's still there, but you're relaxed into the felt presence of being here. Things start to settle, things start to open up. And there are lots of analogies that get used to describe this. And one of them is like, is as if the mind were like a mirror. You've all heard that one, I'm sure. So, if you think about a mirror reflecting everything, it doesn't do it by selecting what it's going to reflect or what it's not going to reflect. It just reflects whatever's there. It's just there, and it reflects it as it is. And, we get glimpses of this. And the more we sit, and particularly when we come on Sesshin, we get clearer glimpses of this. But Saigyo says there's a problem really for us, because this is what happens. On a clear mirror, just a single speck of dust. And yet, looking closely, we see it before all else. People thinking thus. That's kind of what we do. We get everything out of proportion. Those little rhinos and tigers that we think are so important are actually very often just masks. They look really frightening, but when you peel them away, there's not much there. We've killed all the real bears, rhinos and tigers. There's any left. We're just dealing with our imagination a lot of the time. And a lot of what we think is really frightening and really scary and really upsetting is not what's actually in front of us, it's what we're thinking about what's actually in front of us. Do you find that? I've certainly found that in my own life. I went to see a psychotherapist for a while last year because I was getting really upset with myself about how stressed I was getting with the amount of work I was trying to do. And it was a really interesting experience, because the more I talked about what it was that was upsetting me, the more I didn't believe it. It just seemed so, it seemed self-indulgent, but just parking that, it just seemed as if what I was describing was just phantasmic. It wasn't real. It just wasn't real. And sometimes we need to spend time really looking at something before we could see that. Otherwise we just believe it. We believe our own myth, and we go along and we create our own stories, and then we start trying to oppose them. Then we invest all sorts of energy in trying to oppose them and trying to defeat them, trying to overcome them. And there's not even anything there. Really interesting how that happened. So it's like this little speck of dust. And you might think I was reading this thinking, but there's more than one speck, and you might feel like one speck of dust. You're joking. But then don't forget what Huineng said. There isn't actually even a mirror. So where's the dust going to sit? We create these ridiculous complications for ourselves. And the beautiful thing about a practice like sitting in Zazen is that you can just really start, if you allow yourself to do it, you can really start to see it. Just how much unnecessary complication we bring to bear on things. I was looking at, for quite different reasons, I was looking at some old stuff I used to read a lot about Budo, Japanese martial ways. I practice Aikido. One of my friends was writing an MA about why people would do something as strange as wave wooden swords around. And she asked me to explain what I got from it. So I was going back through some of my old material, and I found some letters that the Zen priest Taizan Soho wrote to a Japanese swordsman called Yagyu Munenori in the 17th century, and I started reading that, and I was reminding myself of some quite interesting things. And one thing that Taizan talks about in there is the way in which the mind sticks on things. And this thing about, the game and opposing one another, and how I've already got the 9 stones if I've decided that you're opposing me and that I'm going to defeat you. It comes back to something that he was talking about with Yagyu. He was saying the trouble is that the mind tends to stick really easily on things. If you get into a dispute with your partner or your boss or anybody else, your natural tendency is to want to see them as the problem. And certainly, for myself, I've seen that time and again in all kinds of situations, including here. If you go into an interview on a koan, it's quite easy to go in and see. I think I've had this a lot. Go in and think, I've got a really clear sense of what this is about, and I'm going to present this, and it's going to be great. And I go in and I do it. You're laughing, you know what's coming next. And it's so deflating when the teacher just sits there and goes, no.
Nope.
And then it seems like the teacher is obstructing us. And in a way, that's the way it's all set up. The teacher is there to obstruct us. But is that really what's going on? Isn't the teacher just a mirror? Who's obstructing who here?
I am.
And this is what Taizan's saying. We look at situations in our lives and we get taken in by them. Remember I mentioned those 6 thieves? We see something and we're taken in by it. We think this is the cause of my problem. This out there is the cause of my problem. They're thieves because we allow them to be thieves. Actually, if we actually look back at ourselves and see what's really happening with us, we can start to see where the obstruction really is. So he says that part of the art of practice, and this is why I think it is an art actually, we need to work on this, is to keep coming back and keep looking at what's really going on. And start to see where we're sticking. Because we stick endlessly. I'm not going to give you a list of the places I stick because they're immeasurable. My task is to see that I'm sticking and then to free that up and move forward again. So, that you get these nice analogies used, and people talk about the mind being like ice, and you want the ice to melt and become more like water, so it's clearer and more limpid and can flow around things. And Taizan talks a lot about that sort of thing. And they're helpful ideas. But one thing he said, which I thought was particularly interesting, was that if you look at a tree and the mind sticks, then you're not going to see the tree. What you're going to see is maybe one leaf. So if you're just looking at one leaf, you're not going to see any of the branches of the tree, you're not going to see the shape of the tree, you're not going to see all the other leaves shimmering in the light, because you're fixated on that one leaf. It's in the wrong place. Shouldn't be there. It's the wrong shape. We get really stuck on something very minor, and we don't see the bigger picture. And he says when we notice that and we relax our gaze, then we see the whole tree. We see its shape, we see all its branches, we see all the leaves shimmering. We get the whole picture. And the point he's making, of course, is that most of the time when we get so busy and preoccupied in our lives, that's what we're doing. We're sticking on one leaf. We're not seeing the bigger picture. It's like Saigyo was saying, it's the same point. We see that one bit of dust on the mirror. We don't see the big picture. So we get stuck on one little thing. And Dogen's point is, of course, that if we really allow ourselves to be totally stuck on one little thing, then what do we discover? There's nobody there to be stuck in the first place. And then what? everything's visible again. So there's this constant somersaulting through our experience that's possible in this. Which is why I think that something like this opportunity to get together and sit, and then sit again, and then sit again, and then sit again, is really valuable. Because we're very forgetful and very stubborn, and we need to keep working on this. We need to keep working on it. Keep looking at it. And get out of our comfort zones as well. It'd be very easy to think I understand everything just by reading a few books about it, and never actually sitting on a cushion. First time I actually sat on a cushion, I was horrified. Best as I can remember, it's a long time ago actually, but I think I was horrified. And it was partly what made me take up Aikido as well, because, well, it was karate to begin with, but same point. Because what I realised the first time I sat on a cushion is something that anybody who's sat on a cushion knows, but if you've never done it, you forget, or you don't acknowledge. I had a body, and it hurt. It really hurt, and I was shocked. Oh, I thought it was supposed to be blissful and peaceful, and really nice. It was hell, and that was why I got into karate, because I thought, well, I need to do something with this body and make it more supple and make it work. But I still figured that but what I can do then is avoid the problem with the body. I can get round it. I can make the body malleable to what I want from it. Yeah. So I was still playing the same game. But we have to roll up our sleeves and put our hand into the fire, into the water, in order to know whether it's hot or cold. And you have to engage with something in order to really understand it. See the real tigers and lions, and rhinos and so on. So, when you come to the verse, this is the first thing that Sesshin is pointing out. He reaches out, but it's still inaccessible. People can point things out and offer suggestions, but we've got to do this ourselves. We've got to engage with this ourselves. If we don't, it's inaccessible. Why must the absolute and the relative be an arrangement? There's no bargain. We're not going to be able to sit there and work out how to make my sitting just right, so I just feel perfectly comfortable. Have you ever tried that? Maybe you're not as stupid as me, but I once tried to work out the optimum amount of time to sit, so that it was perfectly comfortable for me. Because I figured, 50 minutes, that's far too long. I can't do that. So I thought, but 30, is that all right? And so I thought, yeah, I think 30 is all right. I can do 30 minutes. So then I started experimenting with it, and I was trying to work out, can I sit a bit more than 30 minutes or a bit less? What ends up happening is you just start reducing the amount of time you're sitting. Because it's like you start to play this little game with yourself where, because at 30 minutes it's uncomfortable, maybe if I sit for 25, that'll be okay. But then you start sitting for 25 minutes, and then at 24 minutes it's getting uncomfortable. And if you're not careful, you can very quickly reduce the amount of time you're sitting down to nothing. And I think the truth is that there is the doing of something, and there is the thinking and theorizing about the doing of something, and they're not the same thing. And the doing of something is always going to be different from the thinking and theorizing about it. And it'll probably seldom be the same twice either. So we actually have to have the courage to constantly step out of our comfort zone and constantly face up to that question: how do I avoid cold and heat? And what does it mean to say, how do I avoid cold and heat? What is this I that's avoiding it? What is avoiding? You have to constantly be willing to do that. And then we find, according to Sesshin, that the crystal palace reflects the bright moon. So it's another one of these analogies that crop up in meditation practice. I have a poem that exemplified it somewhere here. Yeah. This is actually from a martial arts school. Water does not think of giving it lodging, nor does the moon of lodging there. How clear the reflection. No, we don't actually have to do anything when we sit in Zazen. As long as we're alert and attentive and present, then everything is present. Everything comes to meet us. So all the ideas, expectations, all the baggage we bring is beside the point. Because if life is here, meeting us. As cold and heat. So the crystal palace reflects the bright moon. The body presents us with phenomenal experience. Everything else is extra. The sneaky dog goes up the stairs for naught. We always want more. We're always trying to cunningly come up with a clever way of bargaining our way into something. But as Saigyo says, this is what we do. We are thus. We focus in on that speck of dust. Or as Taekwan said, we see the leaf, we don't see the tree.
Can I say something?
Yeah, I've run out of things to say anyway.
What resonates with me is going back onto the cushion, and it gives me the opportunity again and again, even though I forget again and again. But it gives me the opportunity to start again. Every time I sit on the cushion, I can start again.
Yeah. So I'll just read the whole thing back for you again. And then I think it's about 5 minutes. If anybody wants to say anything, please do. 10,000 ages abide in the phrase that determines heaven and earth. Even the 1,000 sages cannot understand the ability to catch tigers and rhinos. Without any further traces or obstruction, the whole being appears everywhere equally. If you want to understand the hammer and tongs of transcendence, you need the forge and bellows of an adept. But say, since ancient times, has there ever been a family style or not? To test, I am citing this old case, look. A monk asked Tozan Ryokai, when cold and heat come, how does one avoid them? Tozan said, why not go where there is no cold or heat? The monk said, what is the place where there is no cold or heat? Tozan said, when it's cold, the cold kills you. When it's hot, the heat kills you. He reaches out, but it's still inaccessible. Why must absolute and relative be in an arrangement? The ancient crystal palace reflects the bright moon. The sneaky dog goes up the stairs for naught. Thank you.